order here. All right, so Alan and I had a session earlier today to kind of discuss how we can align folks on how to make some decisions around, what services go where, how do we actually not overload the existing systems, and how do we actually go to something that is a bit more scalable and maintainable in the long run. And what I was suggesting there is that if the runway project is going to be the carrier of this change for services that are outside of the monolith, we need to actually figure out a way to not necessarily enforce, but inform people how to make some of these decisions, because it does end up being very easy to just say, we'll push everything into the existing setup. But the ease part only comes from one side. We know that we have to scale all of this thing, we know we need to manage all of it, right? And all of that becomes quite a bit challenging with growth. And this kind of aligns with what we spoke at engineering offsite, which is we need to start figuring out how to move away from putting literally everything into the monolith, because it's really hard to scale it. And one of the points that was made there is for the services that are not absolutely strictly necessary to be in the monolith is to actually have a different path forward for that. What a service means and all of that is beside the point, right? It's going to have to be case by case basis decision. But I think that's exactly why we need to figure out how to make some of these decisions so that we can nudge folks in the right direction. So when we were talking about this, we were writing this strategy document. Hopefully it's going to be ready for an issue, maybe even today. But as part of this exercise, we had to kind of think about what is the decision flow someone needs to make, right? How do you actually consider this? We used two services or two recent events as an example of that modeled our thinking, right? How was the embeddings database service, I guess, provisioned or considered? And then also how is the code suggestions feature considered? And those two things are interesting because embeddings database is just a database. It's another flavor of the database connected to the monolith, and that's it, right? The other one is new set of services that are connected one way or another to the existing monolith as well. And one of the things that was interesting for the embeddings database is it's the easiest way for the application, right? Because the code remains in the Rails monolith and using existing processes and so on. But the difficulty is on the infra team that now needs to manage another database cluster. And there were some considerations we could have maybe asked or maybe done in parallel and so on. And the other one is code suggestions, is a good example of a completely new service that doesn't necessarily need to belong in the monolith, and especially if it's going to possibly be leveraged by non-GitLab.com GitLab instances as well, right? There is that consideration. So before I go into this flow that I shared with you earlier, do you have any questions or concerns about anything I said?
Just firstly, actually, so I don't think this is even a new problem, which validates this even further. I think when I was previously in the product development side of the organization, one really obvious example was I think it was the Analyze team at the time, were trying to ship value stream management services. And there was a really strong discussion about what the architecture should look like. And I think we landed on basically building it into the monolith, and which was a really controversial, I think, in hindsight, not a great decision, because it's effectively a data warehouse, and the amount of data we were kind of adding to the primary database and trying to read back just wasn't going to scale particularly well. And I think the reason that decision was made wasn't really for technical reasons per se. It was just, if you was to try and get a new service spun up, and this was probably the best part of 2.5, 3 years ago, that you just wouldn't know where to turn. You wouldn't know kind of how to get that done, who are the right people to speak with. And so, yeah, I think we're going to start to see, and we have seen more of that. And I think a model like this will hopefully answer those questions for development teams.
Exactly. And this is why we didn't name this AI or anything like that, because it's not specifically related to AI. And that's another thing, right? Like, what are we trying to achieve here? We are trying to make it easier for development teams and other teams to actually work with us. And again, move out of the critical path, which is what we are trying to do with Runway as well, right? Now, Runway is being worked on, and there is like quite a lot to be done. But I think where we might get a strong boost is when working with reliability teams, knowing exactly how to think about these things, or how do you actually make decisions on this. So I don't want to go into the explanation mode of how this whole thing works, because, oh, is this cut off? Is there like a scroller here? Oh,
I was able to scroll earlier. I don't know if it's...
I wonder whether it's because of the Zoom. Is this a bug? Oh, there we go. Yeah, it was. So I know how this works because I wrote it, but do you think it would be useful for you to go through the flow here with me, and then like I can just take some notes for myself and we can then discuss?
Yes, I think the first question I had was probably just clarity on who the audience is. Like, is this for us in infrastructure to say, like, someone's coming with us with this idea and we're going to put it through this flow to determine where it ends up? Yep,
the immediate audience is us.
Okay.
Like infrastructure department. So reliability platforms.
That makes sense, because I think when I shared some notes on this earlier, and I won't go into it because I think it is a separate conversation around the subjectivity around do we need a new service, but I think infrastructure's answer to that question will possibly be different from a development team's answer to that question. So I think in the scope of code suggestions, although the architecture was kind of defined before we got heavily involved, I think there would have been strong agreement that we needed a new service for that. So I think that would have basically taken the simple path pretty much all the way through to should and can this run on Runway. And obviously we're at the point at the time where no, it couldn't, because Runway is a very new thing. But I think we've made some really progress even over the last few weeks, where something like code suggestions is an ideal service to run on Runway. Perhaps even more so if we're going to be using like third-party models as well. I think that's a really simple one, to be honest. I don't think there's much more to it.
So let's stand for that one for 1 second, right? We ask ourselves, infrastructure asks themselves, do we need a new service? Development team says no. What do we do there? Well, the first thing is we have to ask a hard question. Are you sure? Please provide me with the details of what are you actually building? Because I think that's where a lot of things break down. We take on face value what is being presented to us, and we don't necessarily have, at least not every time, we don't have the input. Multiple reasons for that. One of them, people simply don't know where to go, right? Like that's one of the common reasons. So we want to be able to answer that question. But let's say they knew how to get to us and the request came in. The development team says, no, we're just going to build this in the monolith. You provide us with a database, embeddings database case.
Yep, okay.
Right? Then what?
So in terms of like what feedback should we be giving to the development team? Yeah, I think this is where it feels to me like the do we need a new service? I think there's a decision model in there, to be honest, and I think a lot of that looks like some of the conversations that you, Andrew, Tim, Michelle, and others have been having over the last couple of days. I think Andrew, in one of the issues, has listed out.
This was this one.
Yes,
This
so there's
issue.
one, yes, definitely. And then I think there's a issue that he wrote. It's kind of a sort of wordy response a few days ago.
That's
where he kind of listed out a lot of the sort of the requirements and concerns. Yes, I think it is in here. Yes. So it's like there's lots of, I think all of probably the headings here are all kind of questions that we would want to consider, right? Like, does data residency matter? Do we expect this service to scale quickly, like code suggestions, for example? If it's going in a monolith, how much risk does this add? How can we contain the blast radius and things like that? So I feel that there's probably like lots of questions to ask there, and some of them will be borrowed from that. Some of them are probably the things that we do in a readiness review at the moment, to be honest. Okay. And I don't know, I guess like a mutual conversation to make that subjective call, hopefully collaboratively, as to which path we take. And I think, yeah, if you land in the no, then I think what's been really clear to me over the last month or two with all of the work that we've been doing on the AI side and new services is actually we do have a pretty mature management infrastructure around the Rails monolith, right? With all of the saturation monitoring and things like that. At the same time, it's very easy to add a feature that blows all of that out of the water, right? And kind of some of these things fight quite quickly. So
maybe to accompany this, right? Like you're right, there is a whole decision matrix just in this box itself.
I think there is, yeah. And I think also on the embeddings database, I also made a note of this earlier. I think with the conversation that we would go back to the development teams and have, I think even, yeah, we don't have to go into this now, but the definitions of a service. So, I think when we talk about services, for example, code suggestions, we thought about it more as like the customer-facing feature, which probably makes sense from a development point of view, that it's a package and you can kind of determine the uptime and availability and app depths of code suggestions. Code suggestions is actually made up of many different, if you want to call them applications or infrastructure services. And I kind of wondered where embeddings would fit in here, because as you say, it's just a database. And it's going to kind of back stuff in the monolith, but it's a separate database, right? And I wonder whether, as you say, like representing that as a service makes it clear that there is infrastructure overhead with that, right? It has to be managed as a service. It's not something that we just get for free.
So let's then I'll play the devil's advocate here, and let's do both of these branches with the embeddings database then, right? Like the embeddings database, if we say we are considering it to be a new service, it's a simple switch, right? Like it goes all the way down. Again, should this run on runway? That's a question that we will need to answer at some point. We discussed that eventually we want to be able to provision these services as they are cattle rather than pets, right? Yeah. So the database team that exists shouldn't be only running the databases, because we need to get away from that. There are too many databases we will need to run. And eventually we might want to say that this could run on runway and we don't have support for it, and we should probably add it in. So that's like an easy path there. But guide me through this line. If we say that, no, it's not a new service, we just need you to provide us a database.
So I guess in terms of, is it being built in the monolith? So I guess you could argue, right, that it's part of our existing infrastructure in a way that we already have a way to provision databases. And as long as it's not a brand new technology, then fair enough. When I looked at this initially, does it need supported infrastructure? Again, that probably, my first thought was, if there was a developer audience looking at that, they might not know. If it's us from infrastructure, obviously there could be some collaboration to figure out what that actually means and what the requirements are of the service. Having said that, both outcomes here will lead to an area where we give more support to that service anyway, right? So either, it's fairly vanilla, we don't expect anything kind of outside of the normal to happen. Therefore, we're going to kind of go to the reliability general team who can kind of offer the standard level of support that they offer for all other services. Otherwise, yes, it is doing something different. We need to consider that. And I think, again, it's nice that Runway is like the default next step. It's like, well, can this go into something that we've already built? Or is it going to be like a repeatable pattern? And therefore, we should get into Runway for later. If so, yes. And kind of back to where we were earlier. If so, no, which I think is kind of, I like the kind of escalating infrastructure leadership, because that seems the most exceptional sort of terminal state, right? In terms of we're doing something, we don't think it's a repeatable pattern, it can't go into Runway, it's not following a normal support model. Therefore, there's going to have to be some decisions made as to what the next steps are.
Okay, so let me run you through my thinking about the embeddings database, following the same route, and maybe we find something to improve here. So, assuming that we said that this is not a new service, just provision as a database, right? Like, is this being built in a model? Well, someone can say like, we're building this feature inside of Rails, and because we want just another database, you do have existing setup, right? Like tooling and so on. You already provisioned the databases and so on. So yeah, sure, let's go. Does it need supporting infrastructure? Well, first of all, embeddings database is a bit of a special case of the existing infrastructure, right? Like, you need to do something a tiny bit different from everything that we are doing right now. So yes, it kind of does need supporting infrastructure. And now we go down the route of the Runway, right? Like, can this support be built in? And the answer is most likely no. Why? Because, well, Runway doesn't support this. It's a one-off. We're not going to need this, whatever, right? Like, we just want to unblock themes, move on. Well, moving on means escalating to infrastructure leadership. And in that case, it comes to Alan and I. How I would address this would be, is there a chance that we are going to have more than one special case similar to this as part of this development flow, right? Like, now is the embeddings database. How much data is it going to store? What kind of management does it require? Is it really a special case? Do we need to run our own cluster? The answer for all of that is probably going to be yes. You need something, like, you need to run it. GCP doesn't support it. My first action would be to go to GCP and ask, this is what we need. Can you support this? And they do give us a quick response on that one. They originally told us no. Within a week, they had something that we could have leveraged. But at that point, we have already.
Are you talking about managed services, or are you talking about their
managed services?
Okay, fine.
The thing is, I and Alan will be asking questions more and more. Can we offload some of this operational complexity to managed services? Whether that managed service is going to be in GCP or elsewhere, I don't want to start that thread, but we will be asking that question. And then that question is going to bring us back here. Why can't we be built in Runway? If it's going to interact with a managed service, it absolutely needs to be there. If we have a timeline where we can actually ask Google to give us support, we can escalate on them and give them high urgency to see what can be done. Specifically for the embeddings database, the urgency is in the industry. So everything that was needed, they basically had to do relatively rapidly. So then the answer becomes, yes, we build it in Runway because we are using managed service. And the only thing we need to do is figure out how to expose provisioning of a managed service within Runway. Do we invest in building a tool or, like provisioning this ourselves and managing operationally? Or do we push back and say, we're going to take a couple of extra days at the beginning of this to not have to pay off or pay dearly later when we have to operate this whole cluster ourselves? build it in runway. So that's how this escalation flow would look like. If I go one step back, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll go ahead. I was going to probably go off on a bit of a tangent, so I can take a step back and we'll come back.
Step back. We say, well, it's not a special case. We don't need anything. We just need another CI database or right, like registry database, main database, CI database, whatever, right? Like we have to do it the same way as usual. Well, in that case, we bring it to the general team. But that's not where, right? Like I didn't want to add more to it. General team has more than enough to decide whether they want to continue business as usual, or if there is something they can do within Runway to add support for what they need to make this repeatable thing. Meaning, if the embeddings database was not super special, if it was a regular database, that does not prevent us from slowly moving away to something that is a managed service. So for example, the question I would expect reliability team to ask is, if it's not a special thing, why can't we use Cloud SQL? Can we use LODB? Right, like all of those things they can ask. And if the answer to all of that is yes, there is no reason why they shouldn't add support in Runway to this. I was afraid of adding more decisions in there because it would water down the message. But I think that's the message both Alan and I want to send forward, is that we want to try to figure out what we can do to create a layer where we do not manage every single thing in existence, but actually manage just one layer of it, which is provisioning of the managed service or provisioning of a service that already exists in one way or another.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think you're right. Like to the terminal flow is to escalate to infrastructure leadership. Like I can see having your own kind of decision flow within there, right? Like all of those things that you consider around, can this be a managed service? And I think this does align with lots of other examples I've seen recently. I think when we provision the Redis for the chat work that's happening, I think actually somebody asked a question to say, like, could we use the Redis managed service? I can't remember, is it Memory Store or whatever it's called in
Memory
Google.
Store.
And it was kind of a, well, you know what, maybe we could, because it's a lot more discrete, contained. We're not running just like one huge Redis patch across like all of GitLab, but we're not there, right? And I think we couldn't really have that conversation at the time, but that would give us options to start to explore stuff like that going forwards. I was also thinking about code suggestions in that, well, what would happen if from the beginning we was going to use a third-party AI model and we decided to build the gateway into the monolith? Because that doesn't seem like too far out of the ordinary a decision that we might have made 2 or 3 months ago. And I think you would come down to this, does it need supported infrastructure? And I think the answer is yes, because the supported infrastructure it needs is the third-party AI models. And there's been work that we've had to do on the infrastructure side to understand them better, to monitor them, to increase quotas and understand quotas. And all of those things aren't necessarily outside of the norm, right? Like having a way in Runway to manage quotas in Google seems like a pretty reasonable thing to be able to do in time, obviously, as a requirement dictates. So yeah, I can see this model being, I guess, succinct enough to answer the immediate questions. And then there's probably just those 2 points of the infrastructure leadership and the very question at the top about, should it be a new service? I think maybe could get expanded over time to make kind of decisions even clearer.
Cool. So you would be able to explain this to other managers. You would be able to drive decisions if you got a request now knowing all of this.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, definitely. And I think not at the very least, but maybe at the very least, it would create the right conversations at each step, right? To make sure that we're making conscious decisions and we understand why we're making them. Okay.
So I want to address something because like the way Mermaids render this, it looks like this is like the biggest part, but like it's not.
Yeah.
This part is also really, really big here. Actually, why did I put this as a blog? This should be a decision as well. Let me edit that. Build it.
Sorry, can I ask a question while you are
Of
doing
course.
that? So I joined while you already started and everything after watching the diagram for the process. After looking at that, this does mean that also all the AI features that goes through the abstraction layer will go through this path, right? Because the abstraction layer right now is part of the monolith. So we actually don't need a new service there.
Which AI features are you referring to there? Like code suggestions
Explain this vulnerability, for instance.
So I guess like to start at the top of the tree, like does that require a new service? I guess.
Sorry, give me 1 sec. I need to. I want to participate in this, but I'm like my brain.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Like, what am I doing? Why is this going wrong now? Oh, it's because it's this one. Oh. Oh man. Yeah, this is correct now. All right. Sorry, Michele. Just one sentence. What did you ask?
So I look at that before joining the call, right? So, and I'm just asking all these features that they use the AI abstraction layer built by the enablement team. That now is simply an endpoint part of the monolith. If we go through this process that you just described, this doesn't require a new service. So this brings me down, if I look at the process, to the place where reliability generals should be actually the one to support these kind of things. Am I right or am I wrong? Because so I can understand when I'm interacting next with people, if it's going to be that one or not.
Liam, you want to take that?
Yeah, I think it probably does. Per this flow, I think it probably does take you down to that point. I think I don't know if you're on the call, Michele, I was talking about code suggestions, and I was saying that if we knew 3 months ago that we might end up using a third-party service for the models, it wouldn't have seemed unreasonable to maybe build the gateway into the monolith. And I think had we done that, I think when we kind of step below what we see now, so it's being built in a monolith, yes. Does it require, I think, what's the next question, Maren? Does it require infrastructure support, supported infrastructure? Well, I think that's then where it maybe depends on each feature. So I think for code suggestions, the answer would be, well, yes, it does actually, because it requires the AI models and then has to manage quotas and such around that.
Exactly. And that's the whole point here, right? So regardless of which way we go with the abstraction layer, this is being still edited, that's why it's blinking, by the way. So if we say that this is just GitLab.com, right, like just a Rails service that needs to call out somewhere, great, but like we don't know that. Someone needs to still provision something in GCP, right, like to be able to connect this. And then the question becomes like, does it actually need support? Like, who's going to click that button? Who's going to, right? Like, it means that something needs to happen. And if something needs to happen, it's not just using the existing system, right? Like, it's not connecting to an existing database, Redis, and so on. Actually, good example you used just now, Liam, the cache.
Yeah.
It's exactly that, right? Like, yes, we have Redis already. We have Redis cache instance. It's existing infrastructure, so it doesn't need any supporting infrastructure. But theoretically, if it went through, it would have blown out Redis cache completely. Like it would push us over the edge, and GitLab.com would not function as we would anticipate. So basically, it would have to go to the general team, and the general team would most likely need some support to understand, like, actually, do we need to do something different here? Whether it's going to be general team that does it or not, they need to be the ones asking the question of, hey, will Redis be okay if we continue pushing this forward? And this is where they need to engage with scalability team. And then this actually becomes a question, well, we realized after investigating that it will actually need supporting infrastructure, separate Redis instance, and then we go into the other branch, which is, do we do memory store? Do we do like whatever, right? Like, do we build it into runway? What exactly do we do? This is where the collaboration will actually, and critical questioning will be necessary from, I don't know whether it's going to be general team. We put general team because it's easier to reason with, but this is where we are going to have like support and provide support to general team when they're asking some of these critical questions.
Okay. Makes sense.
Okay, cool. Any other remarks?
Just looking back to my notes from earlier, I think we've covered everything that I had. No, I think nothing else from my side. I guess that it's still early on. I know you said this is an outcome from this morning, Marion, but what are the next steps on this? How do you see yourself taking this forwards?
Yeah, I mean, Alan and I just finished talking about this like half an hour ago, I don't even know how long ago. We still have some things to wrap up documentation wise. I'm most likely going to put this in an issue in mStuff, and we'll add some supporting text there. And we need to socialize this with the rest of the team, right? Like, you're my guinea pigs in this case, where you are close to it, but now you're way too close to it compared to some other managers. And we need to be able to like reason around this with everyone. But Alan and I realize this is not going to cover every single case because it's not really possible to do that. But our general idea is if we cover 70, 80%, we are already in a good state. And the whole point here is that we actually inform the decision that runway has to become that layer that allows us to scale our support towards development teams.
Yeah, I like that. I think, as you said earlier, it informs the right, like, even for the cases it doesn't cover, it informs the right discussions to happen. And obviously, you know, if we do get good feedback and success through runway, the idea of this diagram is, you know, how do you make it so that you're pushing more and more through that kind of path?
Yeah. All right, great. In that case, let's end the call here. Liam, if you don't mind, could you please update this recording somewhere so that we can share this a bit wider?
Sure. Yeah, I'll add it to the thread in the channel where we were discussing.
Excellent, thank you.